Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event. I'm Mark Nelson, Professor of Philosophy here at Westmont, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce our speakers. Tonight's event is part of the Paul C. Wilt Phi Kappa Phi lecture series. This series was founded to honor longtime member of the Westmont History Department, Paul Wilt, and to showcase some of our finest academic work twice a year for a general audience. It's a special series because in addition to the main lecture, two other faculty members each give 5 to 10 minute responses. And tonight's lecture is extra special because it marks our return to an in-person lecture after a year of Zoom exile. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Elizabeth Gardner, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies here at Westmont. Dr. Gardner graduated from Houghton College and earned a PhD in Rhetoric and Political Culture from the University of Maryland, College Park. She held appointments as instructor in the departments of communication at Maryland and also Messiah College before coming to Westmont in 2016. In 2017, she received the American Society for the History of Rhetoric's Outstanding Dissertation Award. She's an active researcher with 9 articles, chapters or reviews, and 29 conference, paper, or panel presentations. Her research interests include social change and the rhetorical construction of childhood. Professor Gardner's commentators this evening will be Professor Deborah Dunn, also from the Department of Communication Studies, and Professor Mary Doctor from the Department of Modern Languages. They need no introduction to many of you, but for any newcomers or visitors, I will note that Professor Dunn earned the BA from Cal State San Francisco and the MA and PhD from University of Southern California, and came to Westmont in 1997. Professor Doctor earned her BA, MA, and PhD from UCLA and came to Westmont in 1992. The title of Professor Gardner's lecture this evening is Child Workers Redefining a Bolivian Childhood in the Código Niña, Niño y Adolescente. She plans to speak for approximately 45 minutes, after which we'll have brief comments from our 2 commentators. Professor Gardner will then have an opportunity to respond if she wishes, and then we'll have another 15 to 20 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Gardner.
For a moment, when you started to talk about the time limit I started to panic, like, oh wait, what happens if it's different than what I planned? Thank you all for coming. Now, I'm going to start out with a tidbit that may undermine my credibility as a scholar and as a rhetorician, because it forces me to share something that works as clickbait for me, and to admit that I still get caught by clickbait, even though I study rhetoric. Here we go. A few weeks back, without even thinking, I clicked on the following headline. What do the Olsen twins and Greek fishermen have in common? This it sandal. And it wasn't the sandal that attracted me, it was the Olsen twins. Don't judge, but there was a lot of Full House in my childhood. Mary-Kate and Ashley will hold a dear spot in my heart for a while. But there's a reason for this. And the article proved fascinating. It said, introduced centuries ago for European seamen who needed quick-draining shoes while on deck, the sandals have, in more recent years, been appropriated by kindergartners, especially in sparkly jellied versions. Many millennials fondly recall this preschool style. Yes, this is me, except one of mine got sucked off in Lake Pymatuning in a pit of clay, and I was never to find it again. But this is not a complete tangent. It continues. Those memories suggest Telsha Anderson add to the shoe's modern-day appeal. They're nostalgic, says the 27-year-old. Their echoes of a protected childhood make them feel dependable, reassuring after over a year of uncertainty. Somehow, a rubbery piece of footwear is offered up as a symbol of childhood. And what's more interesting is that somehow it's automatically tethered to protection, dependability, and a reassurance of safety in an unsafe world. And this idea is so entrenched that you can put it in as a throwaway comment in a fashion article about sandals. Now, put this quote and this headline into conversation with another set of headlines that came out a couple of years ago. Time magazine. Bolivia to allow children to legally work at just 10 years old. The Wall Street Journal. Newest legal laborers in Bolivia, children. The New York Times. In Bolivia, legalizing child labor. And The Guardian, which is the most kind of colorful or accusatory, Bolivia's child labor law shames us all. The questions and the tone embedded in these articles was very much related to the protected childhood assumed in references to jellied, sparkly sandals. So Bolivia doesn't often attract much international media attention. But in 2014, these stories made headlines. And the story was that the legislature had been going to recommit to and strengthen their child labor laws, aligning with the International Labor Organization's recommendations, so setting it at 14 years old. But as the parliament deliberated, they met with some unlikely opposition, is what many of the articles said. It was the child workers themselves. One of the child workers' groups organized a protest in the streets. It escalated, and police ended pepper spraying and tear gassing the children. Several of them were injured. And so we get depictions of this. And as an aside, I have a seed of an idea about some of these images if you want to follow up later. But a small group of these kids had a very different experience a few days later as they breakfasted at the presidential palace with Evo Morales. And then they also were able to meet with the president of the Chamber of Senators. So after continued advocacy by the children, the Bolivian parliament lowered the minimum age for child labor. And in 2014, the new Código Niña, Niño y Adolescente, the Code of Children and Adolescents, was signed into law, making it legal for 12-year-olds to work and to be employed, and for 10-year-olds to be self-employed, as long as both of these categories of children were still in school. Responses, as you might expect, were polarized. One boy claimed, "For a long time, nobody listened to us. But after the protest, the press reported our cause, and the politicians had to hear our arguments." Meanwhile, figures from across the international community were condemning the move. So Germany made a statement saying, like, Bolivia, bad idea, let's condemn this. The BBC ran a headline that said, "A step back for advancing Bolivia." And Joe Becker of Human Rights Watch said that this move was out of step with the rest of the world. As for me, I learned of this story from my Google alerts. So every Thursday, I get a weekly alert about child labor, and one came in this evening right before the talk. It heralds the weekend. We're almost there. But in 2013, I was deep into dissertation research mode. And so I was studying how in 1910, adult campaigners were working to regulate when and how 10, 12, 14, 16, and even 20-year-olds could work. 1910. And here was a case in 2013 of 10, 12, 14, and 16-year-olds campaigning for the right to work. And so I was automatically intrigued. Western constructions of children have positioned children as precious, innocent, dependent, and in need of protection. And this view is tied to assumptions that children don't speak, or they're not worthwhile to listen to, and that they shouldn't work. But in the face of this, Bolivian child workers successfully mounted a high-profile international campaign for their right to work. They spoke, attracted international media attention, and changed national policy. How in the world? Tonight, in the next however many minutes, I'm going to make the case that Bolivian child workers successfully asserted their rhetorical agency by redefining childhood itself, the construct that traditionally robs them of a voice. And they accomplish this through the argumentative strategy of dissociation. And this strategy helps them to recast an Andean childhood in relationship to a Western childhood around notions of practical needs, work, protection, and education. What makes this interesting? Well, I think it's inherently interesting, but one of the reasons why you should also think this interesting is that these Bolivian kids aren't the only ones who are making a splash on the international scene these days. And so since 2013, 2014, there's been an uptick. We have Greta Thunberg. She's a household name now. She's doing her thing right now. We have the Parkland school shooting survivors and their March for Our Lives. And then we also have Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters who are often high schoolers or college students, or at least they're a part of the mix. The landscape of activism has been changing, and we need to stop and pay attention and think about what are the strategies that are working and what are some of the challenges that are in place. So the preview for the evening, here's your roadmap. I'm going to start out by talking about childhood as a concept, laying that out, looking at some of the hindrances and the possibilities, before looking at the Bolivian context in particular, what was happening there, before explaining the strategy that's at work, the strategy of dissociation, and then looking at that in relationship to the children's arguments. So, the first point. Childhood itself is a shifting construct. We're always seeing children as growing up. As Claudia Castaneda notes, the child is an adult in the making, a potentiality rather than an actuality, a becoming rather than a being. And as a side note, yep, those of you who have had public speaking with me, this is a lesson on why you don't download from Google Slides to PowerPoint right before your presentation. Just as an aside. So viewing children as a becoming, like is done here, focuses on the fact that they're malleable. And if our children are malleable, then you need to be really concerned about their education and their relationships and their activities, because all of those factors could set them up for life well, or it could be their undoing. And what these expectations are hinge on cultural and historical contexts. There's been a lot of attention to romantic or Western notions of childhood that have developed in Europe and the United States, from Philip Aries' groundbreaking studies to some of the more recent work by Viviana Zelzer. As the anthropologist Xandra Pedraza Gomez notes, Western childhood is constructed as an age of physical and emotional vulnerability and psychological and intellectual incompleteness. So thinking about concept of children, they're vulnerable and incomplete. Flattering. Cultures around the globe have protected children for a long time, but the Western view of childhood has defined this age span, and it's an age span rather than necessarily developmental physical category, as a time of dependence, innocence, and protection in the home and the school. Now, this Western view is significant, especially as it's been used to advance American interests and judge other cultures. As the historian Hugh Cunningham argued, the West exported childhood, and sometimes children, as part and parcel of an age of imperialism. It's become a part of international accords and has helped formalize global understandings of children's rights and child labor. And so we can think about some of the touchstones that are part of this. In 1919, the ILO had its first piece of, not legislation, first agreement on child labor and hazardous conditions. And then some other touchstones have been, in 1973, there was the Minimum Age Convention that set the minimum age for labor at 15. And then in 1989, there's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, which guaranteed a child's right to rest and leisure, play, and recreational activities. These constructed childhood as a time for innocence, of imagination, not agency or voice. In this list, and I could have added some more, the CRC is noteworthy because it expanded children's rights. And it says that children have the right to some communication rights. It reads, "The child shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds." Now, within traditional notions, that means there's automatically a tension here. Because as the historian Linda Pollock notes, there's a disjuncture between a public discourse that argues that children are people with rights to a degree of autonomy and the lingering remnant of a romantic view that the right of the child is to be a child. So do you have self-expression, or do you have the right to protection because you're incomplete? On this scene, what then happens when children vocally lobby against policies that are put forward for their own protection, as they did in Bolivia? These Western conceptions of childhood also have made it very difficult to study children and their voices. So children are not viewed as speakers. They're associated with aphasia or speechlessness. Etymologically, children's voices are an oxymoron. They don't make sense because in Latin, the first stage of life is defined in direct relationship to voice. So the word infant means child, and it also means unable to speak. Therefore, trabajo infantil, which is child labor in Spanish, is reasonable, but oradora infantil, a child speaker, defies linguistic logic. Second, when children do speak, as the rhetorician Risa Applegarth traces, they're often dismissed as being cute, incompetent, the dupes of interested adults, or just not children. And the public debate following the activism of the Parkland school shooting survivors shows this. Intermittently, the high schoolers were accused of being character actors or charged with just spouting the positions of adults. As Applegarth asserts, because of the persistent connection between innocence and aphasia, children who speak, who assert, insist, and disagree are rendered anomalous, either not children or not innocent. These same constructs have influenced rhetorical scholarship. So a lot of rhetoricians have studied children, looking at maybe children's literature or education materials for children. Like, we can analyze that, we're happy about that. But they've rarely analyzed children speaking and children's speeches. But within the last few years, that started to change a bit. And we're like, okay, this is a good thing. We're taking children's voices more seriously. Wendy Hesford is part of this call. And she's made the case that we need to think about children's voices in relationship to relational agency. She argues, agency is not an individual enterprise. Rather, an individual's agency is enabled and constrained by cultural discourses and material forces. Like any individual, children speak as complex subjects who are located and who are located in local, a little bit poor choice of language there, located in local and transnational frames and contexts. So in order to analyze these children's voices, we need to know a little bit more about their context. And if we're talking about child labor, what's the Bolivian context? The Bolivian context is this is an ongoing debate that's been had over the last couple of decades. So one side of the debate, as you would expect, is for putting in place legislation to regulate children's work and to say it's for the child's best interests. And on the other side, people are saying, let's legalize child work. And when we legalize it, the government should then make sure it's safe and protecting children. And there's even a debate within the government. And so at points, the Ministry of Labor has been the ones for preventing child labor, while strong voices in the Ministry of Education are for legalizing child labor, which within our context, that might sound odd. But children's organizations have consistently lobbied for this. They want the right to work. And their advocacy isn't easy to ignore. Children's participation in public life was fueled by Bolivia signing the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990. This helped launch several initiatives like a children's parliament in 2003. And so through this, children started to be trained and to learn how to assert themselves in national debates for over a decade before they started to protest on the streets in 2013. And when children participated, child labor became a central issue. It's really funny reading account of one of the early child parliaments, because after one of the sessions ended, the children who were engaging in it said, we want to go and meet with the Ministry of Labor and demand children have the right to work at the age of 10. And the NGO that was working with them was shocked. And they used it to illustrate 2 points. One of the points was, see, children are able to analyze situations and come to conclusions on their own. And the other point was basically, and we need to shepherd them to the right decisions. And so you have children being supported and trained by NGOs to engage in national civic life, but as they learn the system, sometimes they're going against the advice of those who have trained them. They have their own understandings of what's in their best interests. This has been a debate on the ground, but the facts on the ground have remained pretty consistent. Bolivia ratified the ILO's Minimum Age Convention in 1997, and they signed on to the CRC and set its minimum age for child labor at 14, yet child labor is commonplace. About 1 in 4 kids between the ages of 5 or 7 and 15 work. Within world contexts, UNICEF estimates that in the Americas, only Peru, Paraguay, and Haiti have similar rates of child labor. In Bolivia, children work in many jobs, including mining, domestic service, markets, agriculture, and selling newspapers. You might say that they're carrying the banner through it all. Anyone? Thank you, Abby. Newsies reference, because I couldn't resist. One child worker talked about how he was doing all sorts of jobs. He's done everything, from shining shoes to assisting a bus driver to selling chewing gum and cigarettes in a bar. They work so they can earn cash, extra cash, so they contribute to their family's income, to pay for school fees, or just to survive. Child labor is really common. Some Bolivians trace this norm back to the strong influence of their indigenous cultures. The director of a foundation in La Paz argued, in Bolivia, to eradicate child labor, you would have to eradicate Andean culture. And that is impossible. In the Western world, the meaning of a child is centered around the ideas of family security, education, and play. For us, this is a romantic vision. Children living in the Andean world, in Bolivia particularly, have duties and obligations. But besides that, they have an active role in society. Indeed, Bolivia has one of the largest and most influential indigenous populations in all of South America. The 2012 National Survey reported that 41% of the adult population was of indigenous origin. These groups were organized more in the 1990s and became very influential in national politics. The country is now even officially known as the plurinational state of Bolivia, recognizing that it's one state made out of many. And their president, Evo Morales, was the first indigenous president that was elected, and that was in 2005. And his indigenous heritage became very much a part of the political arguments that were used. So indigenous identity in Bolivia isn't homogenous or fixed, but it has been used and contested in politics. And when we put this into conversation with child labor, indigenous understandings of work and childhood feature prominently in the debate over child labor. These understandings or commitments are particularly apparent in two of the indigenous languages, Aymara and Quechua. Aymara and Quechua do not have a broad conception of work as is present in the English language. There's a lexical gap. The sociologist Manfred Leibel points out that the term work in these languages excludes domestic or agricultural jobs or tasks done in the community. And then also, the Bolivian education system accommodates this position. Commonly, schools operate in 2 5-hour shifts so that children can either go in one or the other, and they can go to school and then work in the evenings or vice versa. And so these local factors helped to shape the debate over child labor that attracted international media attention in 2013. The fact that children decided to protest in the streets also reflected the local culture because protests are common in Bolivia. Under former President Carlos Mesa, there were almost 800 protests in the year and a half of his leadership. And children had been organizing, planning, unionizing, and advocating for themselves for over a decade. And they spearheaded a couple of initiatives through organizations like the Bolivian Union of Child and Adolescent Workers, UNATSPO. So this was an organization that was founded in 2003. It's one of the largest unions of its type. It has about 15,000 members. They have their own leaders that are elected. They set their own agendas, and they starchly defend child labor. They don't see child labor as a problem. They think the problem is that children are not offered the same protections as adult workers. And they say some pretty sharp things about adult union movements and what their problem is. And they've had some successes. So child news vendors were able to win a raise in one city. And they've been educating child workers on their rights and their health issues. In 2008, UNATSPO successfully proposed changes to the wording in the Bolivian Constitution. So they did a new constitution and they submitted this language. And then, with help from NGOs in 2010, they came out with this over 100-page document defending their right to work. So, when this legislative debate comes up in 2013, children had years of experience. The code itself covered a range of welfare issues, but UNATSPO concentrated their lobbying on the regulation of child labor. And in the end, these are the provisions that veered the most from what the ILO said was best. So where children were the most involved is where the most controversy arose. So Bolivian children spoke out and were heard. One representative of the Child Workers Union, Edwin Roman Davalos, reported, "We are happy with the enactment of the law because they listened to us. The authorities and the assembly members saw our reality." Lizeth Castro, the president of UNATSPO, argued, "The law gave us a voice." Child workers strategically asserted themselves and gained an international audience. And prominent news outlets, many of the ones that I started with in my introduction, covered the children's activism and this new law. And this international coverage was exceptional. Children usually aren't covered in the news, and certainly their voices aren't quoted. But these kids were interviewed, and their actions were shared. At the same time, this coverage highlights the continuing challenge to studying children and their voices. Because the media culture, or the media coverage, even though it was there, was still partial. Audience adult reporters selected quotes to pass along to their audiences. And so out of the 71 international English language articles, editorials, videos, posts that I looked at, over 60% did not quote child workers at all. So if you think about that, imagine if there was a story about women and it didn't quote women. Imagine another marginalized group, and if members of that group's voices weren't integrated into the case, people would be surprised and shocked that wasn't really commented on in these articles. So their voices were abstracted and processed. And so in my first draft of this paper, that's what I focused on. I dealt with the text in its own terms, looking at the international media coverage. It's exceptional, but it's still partial, and how can we theorize that and work with children's voices in that space? And I had a friend read it, and I was really excited, and the feedback she gave me is like, well, if this is what you're critiquing, perhaps you should stop doing the same thing in your own research. I was like, blast you. Good point. And so I've been working to broaden what text I'm bringing in since then. So I already knew that UNATSPO had this over 100-page document, Mi fortaleza es mi trabajo, my strength is my work. And then I was also able to find Bolivian coverage from a range of sources. And fortunately, a current and now former student, Rebecca Garcia Hernandez, was able to come work with me on this project. And so she read and translated parts of Mi fortaleza es mi trabajo, and then she read through the Bolivian coverage and was abstracting that and pulled out some quotes. And across the coverage, a couple of lines of argument started to bubble up. Child workers regularly asserted their right to work by partially redefining childhood. This is the concept that made their economic contributions controversial and undermined their efforts to speak. And they relied on dissociation to do this. And so in order to unpack dissociation, we have to look a little bit about the function of language. As David Zarefsky notes, to choose a definition is to plead a cause. In such choices, power plays a significant role. Dominant groups throughout history have defined others rather than recognizing the competence of these groups to define themselves. Scott Richard Lyons calls this move rhetorical imperialism. He defines it as the ability of dominant powers to assert control of others by setting the terms of the debate. These terms are often definitional. That is, they identify the parties discussed by describing them in certain ways. And he traces how this move was used in US policies and judicial decisions to erode the national sovereignty of American Indians. And so in legislation and in court proceedings, we see this rhetorical erosion happening as the US government moves from talking about American Indian populations as sovereigns to talking about them as wards. There's a steady shift from talking about them as nations to tribes, talking about treaties to these are just agreements. This quick example illustrates that definitions are strategic and dynamic, but they are also sites of contest and resistance. In our current day, Indigenous leaders have protested at sporting events that have American Indian mascots. As Jason Edward Black argues, the embodied presence of American Indians at these protests challenges the essentializing definitions that mascotting perpetuates by asserting a fuller image of what it means to be Indigenous. These contests over definitional power are tricky. Sometimes they entail identifying with a concept, and sometimes there's a little bit of a distancing work. And that's where dissociation comes in. Dissociation is a tool used by readers to settle incompatibilities within a single concept by breaking it down. Chaim Perlman and Lucy Albrecht's Taiteca describe dissociation as a remodeling of a term. So we're not like raising the whole house and building a new one. We're working with the existing parts. Instead, there's a breaking apart that modifies the concept and ranks its new parts, arranging them into a hierarchy. One of the parts will be positively valued and the other will be negatively valued. It's pretty abstract, so let's deal with an example. And we can look at Ronald Reagan's discourse and his conversation about the truly needy. This phrase dissociated the concept of needy into the truly needy who really needed help in America, and the apparently needy who only appeared to need help and whose programs could be cut. Zareski and his co-authors highlight the strategy involved in such dissociations. These moves allow a subtle redefinition of key terms so that the previously unitary meaning of a term, like needy, which one wishes to discredit, is connected with the negative valued term, apparently needy, and one's own position is linked with the favorably valued term, the truly needy. Up to this point, most studies of dissociation have looked at Western discourse, and that's where Perlman and Olbrecht-Titeka focused with their research. But recent scholarship has said we need to think more about context and culture, and we need to start looking beyond. And there's also been more attention to power differentials when it comes to dissociation. And so we have a notion like a dissociative disruption, which Janice Fernheimer brings into the conversation. This idea acknowledges that even seemingly failed dissociations can expand an existing identity in part or in time. So eventually, it might shift the concept. And I think these are the types of moves that these Bolivian child laborers were making in their arguments. And I see them using 4 interconnected dissociations, a complex of 4 interconnected dissociations. There's the ideal versus the practical. And this is actually one of the dissociative pairs that Chaim Perlman and Lucy Olbrecht-Titeka name early on. There's Western versus Andean, there's protection from work versus protection from exploitation, and there's education as schooling versus education as formation. In each of these pairs, more value is placed on the latter term as being appropriate for childhood in their specific cultural, political, and economic context. Collectively, these dissociations shift the meaning of childhood. And while they're doing that, they challenge the barriers that have kept children from being seen as speakers or from being workers. So first, ideal versus the practical. Bolivian child workers appealed to this dissociation. They argued that in the Bolivian context, practical considerations were pressing. The ideal of a childhood free from work might be nice, but there were real-life demands to be met. And so a child worker named Alicia explained, "There are days when I want to go out and have fun like the children I see go to the movie theater. But I see the effort my mother makes, and I forget all about that. How can I rest when she doesn't?" Like Alicia, young Bolivian union members made an eminently practical case. They argued that a higher value had to be placed on what was practical because of the reality of their lived situations. The precious children of UNATSPO were realists. This dissociation directly challenged the Western idea of childhood as a time for imagination. You've got these Bolivian realists and our ideals of imagination. And the workers established the importance of the practical side of this question by framing their work as a necessity. In Bolivia, a 15-year-old bricklayer named Eddie explained, "It is a necessity for children to work at a lower age. Children are working all the time." And protesters in La Paz turned this dilemma on their audience, saying, "If I don't work, how will my family eat?" Bringing their audience into the conversation. One child advocate kind of defiantly noted, "Look, we have to work. Our families don't have enough money. We want to give our mothers money so they can buy food. We want to buy our school supplies. We work, and we're going to continue to work." Interestingly, in this dissociative pair, child advocates didn't say that this was the right approach for everyone. Rather, they said it was the practical need in Bolivia. A member of the Niños, Niñas y Adolescentes Trabajadores, the NAT, another children's union, told researchers, the ILO has policies on labor, but they work more internationally. What we would like more is a national organization that reflects the politics of Bolivia, because we have our own national reality. We don't live in the same world as other countries. So Bolivia's culture and economy made practical considerations uppermost. These last quotes begin to highlight the second dissociation that commonly arose in the child workers' arguments between Western and Andean norms. So UNATSPO laid the groundwork for this dissociation by challenging Western definitions of childhood in their document, My Strength is My Work. They noted that the term child, with its attention to age, was far from the sweet notion inherited from the original Andean people of the Wawa. They described the Wawa as a way of being and doing things. So Wawa let themselves be raised. This is still an idea that's a little bit confusing. The definition is a little confusing to me. The Wawa let themselves be raised. Also, as Wawas, we raise our parents. Wawas are small, but we are also Wawas the big. The Wawas are an important part of life and for the life of the communities. This definition of Andean children centered on their engagement in the community. Unlike the ideal image of a child that the United Nations proclaims, UNATSPO asserted, and they specifically call out the ILO and the UN. They assert that the hardworking, indigenous, fighter, rebel, and organizing child was a part of the Bolivian people's identity. Both of these characterizations of childhood are striking for how they depart from the Western norm. And at this point, remember sparkling jellied sandals and connect that out with the rebel fighter child. The Andean child isn't dependent and fragile. The Andean child is defined in terms of their actions and their interactions. And there's oftentimes in this also a focus on work, Andean versus Western work. Like childhood, these child speakers cast the Andean view of work as focused on community life. They stress that each boy or girl is involved in all parts of the community life, from gardening, from agriculture, to planting and meetings, the whole gamut. One child worker traveled to Geneva, Switzerland to defend the new law that was put in place in the country. And when she came back, she was speaking to the rest of her organization. And she said, the European child does not work because he has no need, nor a work culture. And they want to impose that model on us. But our reality is different. So in balance, the local Andean option was to be valued and preferred as appropriate for the Bolivian context and culture. The third dissociation that they used regarded the concept of protection. And so we've looked at or touched briefly on the ILO minimum age convention that said no child labor under the age of 15. UNATSPO called this idea that children need to be protected from the rigors of work an emotional, paternalistic, and ethnocentric argument from the North. These kids don't really hold back. And so in contrast, these young activists held on to the guarantee of protection. So they're still saying, yeah, protect us, but they're saying, don't protect us from work, protect us from exploitation. So it's a recasting of what protection entails. UNATSPO asserted and gave actually a definition of protection. They said the state will guarantee the protection of children and adolescents from all forms of exploitation and performance of any work that is dangerous or damages their education, is harmful to their health, physical, mental, or social development. It's the government's responsibility. And child activists regularly claimed that the new Bolivian child labor law would protect them. Now, how this worked out, or if it actually worked out, could be debated. Well, maybe not debated, might be pretty clear. But the children said, this will protect us. This is what we need. Fourth dissociation was used by the child workers as they talked about education. They cast work as a necessary formative experience of childhood rather than Western childhood's stress on play, school, and home. Representatives of UNATSPO offered up work as essential to a child's formation. They attributed positive functions to work. Rodrigo Calle, a 14-year-old labor leader, argued, "The work of a child or an adolescent is not bad. It helps society. It helps a family, and it helps us grow as people." Instead of reimagining childhood totally, this shift simply realigned what activity was cast as central to a child's formation. And so it's these four interrelated dissociations that child workers strategically adapted a definition of childhood to their local context in order to lobby for their right to work. They still claim the rights to childhood. They even use language which is rooted in US judicial cases from the late 1800s about the best interests of the child. They used the best interest of the child. They said, yes, protect us, but they had a different idea of what that meant, and they used dissociation to make that claim. So the quick summary to my project here is we haven't studied children's voices, in part because of our assumptions about what childhood is. And the swell of national and international child-led movements is making it apparent that we need to, specifically with attention to context and culture. The Bolivian child workers help us to do that as we study this campaign. Their strategies of dissociations challenged the Western construction of childhood and asserted their own Andean view. And it was a particularly fitting response to deal with the incompatibilities of being a child and wanting to speak. This remodeling of the concept of childhood made it possible for the 16-year-old president of UNATSPO to confidently assert that by working, you do not lose your childhood, as UNICEF says, but you even have a better childhood. You learn life faster and solve problems. So I have two concluding points to kind of stimulate thought. The first one, if you are not getting child labor alerts, you may not know that there's an ongoing debate in the United States about child labor right now. Will we loosen regulations for child labor in the wake of the labor shortages that we've been seeing? The arguments that have been talked about, what I have seen expressed, are framing it as industries are looking to hire, and politicians are weakening child labor laws. There's very little children's voices in these stories. And when the few quotes that I've seen from children, it's them saying, like, it's really hard to work till 9 p.m. at night and then get my schoolwork done and then come to school. It's hard to do both. So that's one little thread for you to think through. And then the second one. UNATSPO's campaign successfully influenced the trajectory of national policy through remodeling a concept of childhood. Child labor was legalized for 10 and 12-year-olds. But the rest of the story drives home the point that the centrality of power in definitional arguments. Because according to Manfred Leibel, international pressure caused Bolivia's parliament and senate to remove these new laws 4 years after they were put into place. And this follow-up story didn't make the international headlines. But Bolivia's vice president justified this repealing by charging the United States, saying they threatened to withdraw advantageous tariffs on exports if this provision remained in effect. And so where does this get us? This development highlights the dynamic nature of dissociative argument and reinforces the idea of dissociative disruptions. Breaking apart incompatibilities within a concept for a time, but remaining inseparable for the larger context and culture in which they're voiced. Thank you all for listening. I'll turn it over to Dr. Dunn.
The forward button, as in the little doohickey? Okay. Sorry, that's one of my mom's words. Thank you, Dr. Gardner. I don't know about you, I got a preview of the paper ahead of time, so both the paper and the presentation, maybe I'll take this off, super enlightening and eye-opening for me. And one of the wonderful things about being a respondent at something like this is that I get to learn new things. So in this case about Bolivia, about the rhetorical construction of childhood, and about a super handy rhetorical tool that I didn't know about before called dissociation. I think that one of the things that Dr. Gardner does so well in her paper is to present a very particular case that then causes me, anyway, to question so many more things than are directly addressed. So, as you just heard, she presents the case of Bolivian child workers. And when you hear that Bolivia legalized child labor for 10-year-olds, before you hear the whole presentation, how many of you sort of recoil in shock and you have this extreme sense of injustice? And if you're like me, you might remember certain iconic photographs that were taken by Lewis Hines, 1910, 1911, in this country, which then led to a lot of the laws that Dr. Gardner was talking about that then prohibited child labor at really young ages, because you just look at these and you can get a sense of how outraged the public was when they saw these photos for the first time. And the rhetoric about what that meant, the end of childhood, the loss of innocence, all of those things. So when I see those images, even today, I look at those and I just think, yeah, those are children who have been wronged. They didn't get a childhood. They didn't get to go to school. They didn't get to play and imagine. They didn't get to have this childhood characterized by innocence. They're just being chewed up and spit out by a greedy system looking to exploit anyone and anything. Isn't that kind of what you feel when you hear child labor? And yet, what Dr. Gardner does so well in her presentation and her paper is to turn my first response, if not upside down or inside out, at least on its side or some other kind of spinny thing. Children who are meant to be seen and not heard, certainly not meant to be labor organizers and agitators, argue not that they're entitled to innocence and play and imagination, but to fairness and protection under the law. So imagine if the kids in Lewis Hines' photographs had organized for safer working conditions. We might have a really different society. And Dr. Gardner further spins things around by arguing that children are among the marginalized voices. And so I've been an advocate for years. Yeah, we need to hear the marginalized voices. It just never occurred to me that the marginalized are the children. So by the end of Dr. Gardner's paper, I'm cheering for these kids and their rights to work. And then, of course, she ends it by telling us, oh yeah, that only lasted 4 years, thanks to the good old USA. So, but I think this whole thing kind of leads to some darker truths that Dr. Gardner hints at but doesn't fully explore. And I'd love to see her do more with this. So she does a really excellent job unpacking how the children use these very sophisticated rhetorical strategies, such as framing and taking advantage of sort of a movement toward reclaiming this Andean indigenous cultural identity, but also dissociation, which is, again, a new term for me, a rhetorical device where the rhetor separates one concept into two new concepts so that the rhetor can fundamentally change the reality of the thought system that's in question, right? And that rings true. I mean, I've often commented that when I hear students debate especially, but really it applies to all debaters, whoever defines the terms usually wins the debate. So if you say, what I mean by voting irregularities is this, you set the terms, and the less sophisticated debater, if they don't challenge those terms, they're really doomed to lose the debate. So it is all about the defining of the terms. So after she explains dissociation in the paper, she goes on to provide these very excellent examples, which you just saw, right? The ideal to the practical, from Western to uniquely Bolivian or Andean, from protection from work to protection from exploitation, and from education as school to education as formation. I thought that was very well done, and there's a lot of evidence from the discourse, so you really hear the voices of the children in that. And a lot of scholarly papers don't do that. They opine, but they don't really bring in the examples. So I thought that was probably one of the hallmarks of the paper. The beauty of this kind of analysis is that she breaks it down into such a clear way that you can't believe you never noticed that before. And so I think that's the hallmark of good scholarship, because once you learn it, you just think, oh, duh, why didn't I think that? Why doesn't everybody know that? Why don't we always talk about that? So thank you for that. And yet, despite how well done this analysis is, I wanted Dr. Gardner to go a step further to unpack a world in which children can't play, imagine, go to school, and be innocent past the age of 10. I'm sure that not all of the kids in Bolivia need to work. In fact, you just said 1 in 4 do have to work. But that's the same here, right? Some kids have to work, but there are a lot of kids who can't imagine having to work. I have a lot of friends who don't require their children to do chores. So what's wrong with a society that, wait, now I'm being Western again, right? I am imposing my fantasy of what a child should be onto everybody else in the world. I'm falling back into that. And yet, I think most of my dis-ease after reading this paper does rest in my own Western bias about what constitutes childhood, but I also think it rests somewhat, at least, in recognizing the fallen and inequitable nature of the world, because not all children, even in Bolivia, even in the Andes, have to work. And her project shows us how powerful our words and images are. They shape not only what we think is right, but what we think is possible. So showing us how the Bolivian children challenged the imperialist and colonial notions that they found repressive, she also shows us how powerful rhetoric is to shape the laws and the destiny of a people. But again, the dark side, how quickly that is overcome by a more powerful player, and in this case, the USA. Still, even if I'm a product of a Western construction of childhood, I still grieve that children have to work in order to put food on the table and pay for their schooling. And that's coming from somebody who had to work as a child. I did not work in a coal mine. I did not work tending the looms of industry, but I worked in the home, and then I started working outside of the home. So I did a lot of yard work. I did babysitting. I preferred the yard work because there weren't screaming children. One time I tried ironing. That did not work out so well. But I earned wages outside the home. Maybe the difference is that my wages went to buying my favorite records and shoes, as opposed to, again, putting food on the table. My first paycheck from a real job, and by real job I mean I got a real paycheck, not just cash from a neighbor, was working at a feed and tax store. And some of you probably have no idea what that is. But I brought home the first paycheck, was really proud of it, and my dad told me that when he was growing up, every paycheck he donated, I forget what, but a huge percent to his parents. He gave that money to his parents. And then he talked about how when his father was laid up with a broken back for 1.5 years, my dad had to go out and shoot small game to put protein on the table for dinner. And then he looked at me, and my response was, "So are you saying you want part of my check?" And he just sighed, shook his head, and walked away. And I knew that I had disappointed him on this deep, fundamental level, but I wasn't exactly sure how. I thought it was a legit question. "So are you saying you want some of my check?" Anyway, I guess my point here is that I resonate with every one of the arguments that are made by the Bolivian child workers. I do think of education as formation, and that part of that comes through work. It forms our character. And I do think that we must be practical and can't live on dreams of a fantasy childhood that only exists for the very wealthy. And I do think that local context matters. And of course, I think that children and all workers require protection from exploitation. And yet, because of global inequities, the children must work if they want to eat and if they want to go to school. And it's not just work on a family farm or in a family trade, as would have been true for most of human beings throughout most of human history. It's work outside the home for a wage in a potentially unsafe environment surrounded by adults who will take advantage of them. Or is that just the Western part of me and my fantasy reasserting itself? Maybe it's thinking of the child as being under the protection of the angel of the home, the angel being the woman in the home, being the woman's sphere, which so dominated the era in which we constructed our ideas of childhood. So I'm not sure what to do with that. It's a far cry from a Wawa idea, which I really want to know more about. One minor thing, in a couple of places, Dr. Gardner uses the word precious, and I'm not sure if she's using it in the way that some people use the word today, laced with a bit of sarcasm, oh, that's so precious, or if she means it in the way of a very precious gem. A darling baby in a cute outfit chortling merrily is precious in one way. A child much loved by parents, however poor, is precious in a different way. And finally, I'd love to hear more about how this case leads to a reimagining of identity as a way out of identity politics, which is a little bit of a claim in the paper. I'm not sure that that was my takeaway, but I'm intrigued and want to know a lot more. Mostly, I'm very grateful for Dr. Gardner's good work and leave here feeling enlightened, if still conflicted, about how we conceive of childhood, both home and abroad. So thank you, Dr. Gardner.
Thanks to both of you. This is so much fun. Man, I am so delighted to be here tonight. And I just have a full confession to make at the beginning. I'm not an expert in Andean culture. I know nothing about labor policy, international law, or children's rights. Have a question about a poem? I'm your gal. I can help you with poetry. But this was really a stretch for me. But that said, when I read your paper, it made me want to learn more. I was fascinated by it. And so not only did I read your paper, as you know, but I dug through the 130 pages of the original document in Spanish because I had so many linguistic questions that were just really troubling me. And then I called a friend in Peru who lives in an Andean culture, and I was like, can you help me understand this? And I called an anthropologist in Chicago, and I wrote a Bolivian linguist that I didn't even know. And it made me go down several rabbit holes, I'm not gonna lie, and I hope I'm not too rambly today. But it made me grateful to be part of a community that regularly asks us to think beyond our disciplines, to be able to learn something new, and to have explored an issue that, quite frankly, I might have ignored, and I did ignore, and to think about it in new ways. And I'm also grateful to all of you for your generosity in being here and participating in this discussion. So I want to just say, first and foremost, what I appreciated the most about your paper, of course, from somebody who loves studying about culture, is that you framed your analysis as one that extends our understanding of a complex issue in relation to context and culture. And I find that so often, especially here in the West, we don't do any of that, that we're constantly looking at issues through the lens of our own ethnocentrism without even realizing that we are. It made me think, I better go through those syllabi. How many Western writers do I have on it? How many international writers? How many other thinkers do I have? How many marginalized voices? And I, like Deborah, full confession again, it's going to be a confessional for me, I can tell. My gut reaction when you first told me about what your paper was about was judgment and shock. I was appalled. But I had to admit that I was doing exactly what I tell my students not to do. I was making a quick judgment with little information through the lens of my own culture, my own experience, and quite frankly, my own privilege. So your paper made me take a step back and practice what I preach and really get into the issue and see how I felt about it. I'm just going to jump to my conclusion, and then I'm going to go back and share some things. Here's what I came out thinking, and it's very similar to Deborah's, although I don't know. I think I was really disappointed. You convinced me, well, not you convinced me, the children convinced me, even though I saw lots of flaws in their arguments, that the law was a good thing, and that the pressure that the ILO in the United States put on Bolivia to repeal the law actually did more to harm children, the population they were striving to protect, by stripping away their protections than to help them. So I was disappointed in that policy. And I was, the problem, of course, as we all know, is poverty. It's not children working, it's poverty. And how can we address that issue kind of to meet Deborah's idealized world, which could be Western, but I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So those were some of my initial gut reactions. I'm going to kind of focus on a little bit about the central question I had in your paper, because out of the 4 arguments that the kids make and that you unpack for us, I thought the first one was by far the best, the ideal versus practical. That was the strongest. I almost wish they had stuck to that and then added on the third one, protection from exploitation. I thought those 2 were solid. They should have stopped there. Andean versus Western for me was blurry. Andean is huge. You can't just say Andean. I mean, we're talking about La Paz, Bolivia, big metropolises, and we're talking about indigenous villages up in the hills. They're very different environments. So that was a little slippery for me, how in the document the kids were constantly calling everything Andean, and I just wondered what they meant by Andean. The other one, and the hardest one for me, and this is where my rabbit hole started, was that last one, formation as schooling, formation from work. And I had several questions about that. But first, let's start with childhood, because children working is kind of at the central issue here, and what is work? I loved how you talked about what is best for a child not only hinges on historical context, because childhood is a shifting construct, and we learned that when we did Trailhead. Even in this, childhood is constantly shifting in how we look at adolescence, but a cultural one as well. And the Western view of the economically worthless but emotionally priceless child, of children as innocent, dependent, in need of protection, and of this romantic childhood which privileges rest, leisure, and play, which I think absolutely embodies my view of it, is so dramatically different from the indigenous view. First of all, children are not economically worthless. And in fact, I think in our culture when we send that message, because kids get it, like how much you cost, and there's been studies in teen suicide where children feel a sense of worthlessness, lack of purpose, and a burden on their family because they're constantly hearing this. And I have to confess, sometimes I say things like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this tuition payment. I've got to watch myself if I'm sending that message that you are costing me so much, even though you're emotionally priceless to me. So that was just a message to me and how I talk about, my economic reality right now. But in an Andean culture, in indigenous cultures, more children is actually better because you have more hands to do the work, to help out in the home, to help out in the field, to help out wherever you might need that help. And also, child work as being antithetical to childhood is the opposite. In these cultures, children are raised to work. They say that in their document from a very young age. They learn to cook, to hoe the fields, to do all kinds of things. I remember watching a documentary of this Bolivian 3-year-old with a knife, not a knife, a machete, like slicing something. And I think we would never allow a 3-year-old to do that because it's too dangerous and we protect our children. But from a very young age, they're actually trained and schooled and learn how to do this. They do a broad range of chores, and it reminded me of, I don't know how many of you heard the NPR stories. It was started in 2018, I think, and then they've replayed several of them. It was a thing called How to Raise a Human, and they focused on child rearing among many, many cultures. And the ones that intrigued me were the ones on Mayan children. and why Mayan moms don't have to nag their children. I'm like, I gotta listen to this. And it was fascinating. This Westerner comes in and like, how are these children waking up in the morning and doing their chores? Nobody's complaining. The mom's not yelling. There's no nagging. The kids aren't bickering. And they're doing everything nobody asks them. And why is that? And why can't I make my kids do that? Well, the answer is they're not separated from adult society. We're really good at having adults and children, and we kind of keep them apart. Even like if you look at kids' clothing, they're not like little adult clothing most of the time. They're quite different, like these bright colors and weird patterns. If you look at an Andean child, they're wearing like the same nightshirt. It looks exactly like an adult's, just miniature. It's not like this big pattern, We have the kids' world, mom goes to work, kids go to school, and we keep them apart. Kids have their own special meals oftentimes. And it's just not like that in many parts of the world. Adult culture is not restricted from the children, and they're not perceived as being too young, uneducated, or burdensome to be admitted into adult culture. And they don't try to control their kids. In fact, the word control, as it refers to children, is not even a word in many Andean languages. They don't use that word because it's seen as collaborative. Work is a collaborative experience that we do together, and kids actually want to be with adults. And so that intrigued me. But this kind of brings me to the issue that I had with the whole last concept, because it seemed to me in the paper, when they were talking about education as formation and the importance of work, that's the kind of work I thought they were talking about, right? That kind of work in community, protected, reciprocal, helping the family out. And so when you said there was a different word for work in Quechua and it didn't refer to that, that's what got me onto the deep dive. And I wanted to read the original document, and I wanted to see. My theory is if we were reading Quechua, there would be 2 words used throughout the document for the kind of work they were talking about. What was disappointing to me, and by the way, as a linguist, words matter and translations matter, and don't use Google Translate. I had a whole story prepared to tell, but I'm out of time here, so I won't tell it, but really important to pay attention to how words are used across cultures and don't just use the same word. So my theory was there'd be 2 different words. And so when I read the document, I was actually a little disappointed to see that I thought what was happening was they were conflating the terms in a way. So they were talking about work being this great thing that's formative, but they were talking about this idealized, romanticized Andean work in community, and yet also talking about this, what they called more exploitive, brought in from the conquest, this kind of work was brought in by the Europeans, and this is the kind of work we have to do for wages and to slave over. So that was to me the weakest point of the kids' arguments. I thought the way you framed it was great, though, because you did exactly what was happening in their document, although I'm wondering if you had any other ways to look at that. And my Peruvian friend, that was also her biggest issue, was she said, even though she was very westernized, she said, I think that's the kind of work that's formative. There's nothing formative about sending a kid an hour away to a city to lift heavy loads or to work in a brick factory and to come home too depleted to study or to concentrate. That's not the formative work they're talking about. So I found that whole piece of the puzzle problematic. But I still agree with points 1 and 3. And I want to just conclude here with 2 questions for you. Because we're looking at culture, I wanted to kind of bring this all back to our own subculture. We all live in different cultures, right? And I want to bring this back to our evangelical Westmont subculture, and I have 2 questions. One involves agency. Oh, and by the way, real side note, wawa, okay, infante, Spanish, unable to speak. Wawa, anybody knows the etymology of that word? Wawa. Wah, wah. It's an onomatopoeia. It comes from the cry of a child. And it's used in multiple Andean languages, not just Quechua. Amparo, many, many languages. And if you look up kindergarten or PETA, it's all rooted in that word. And it was fascinating to me that where infante or infant comes from inability to speak, wawa is actually, the root has to do with speaking, with the sound a child makes. Anyway, so regarding agency and voice, I'm wondering, how do we, in this community, this is for the students, how do you feel that Have we hurt your agency in some ways? Do you feel you have a voice? How good of a job do we do at listening, truly listening to you folks who also have something really important to say? And we've heard you on this campus over the last several years make your points, and I'm just wondering how speedily or how well we hear you. Secondly, the word evangelical. I was fascinated by dissociation. And I'm wondering if the word evangelical today is in need of some creative dissociative disruption. I feel that word has been changed over time, and I'm wondering if we're able to break it apart to settle some incompatibilities within today's culture. Can we give it a new identity, perhaps, a new definition without demolishing the original concept? Much like the children did in their arguments, and to choose a definition is to plead a cause. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that, and if there's any other words in our culture that you think might benefit from a little creative dissociation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn and Dr. Doctor, for that. Some of the questions that you posed, I have to mull on. Some of the tension that you feel, I also feel in my being. And so, evangelical, yeah, seems like there's a project in that. I don't know if there are other concepts that come to mind, but I have to ponder. And precious is priceless. It's a gem. One of the foundational pieces in the study of childhood is Viviana Zelzer's Pricing the Priceless Child. And so you're priceless, but you're expensive. But if there are questions, I would love to take a stab. Abby.
Yeah, so you quoted one of the children, and the child said the law gave us a voice. And I've been wrestling recently with this idea of giving voice. And I just wondered if you could address that. Obviously, it's what the child said, so you don't need to say what the child said is wrong. But just what you think about this idea of giving voice. Do you think that the changes in the law are capable of giving voice, or did the child already have a voice? How does that hurt the agency?
It's a great question, which will get back to a concept that you've heard me talk about in class a little bit before. So whether it is Wendy Hesford, who I brought in, who's been doing research, and she's written this book about spectacular childhoods, where she talks about we need to focus on children's relational agency. And so not just seeing a child innately being a speaker, but seeing a child with a voice and understanding that they're within a larger context and culture. And I think that makes sense because that's true of me as well. Like, I think we all have this relational agency, ability to speak, but then we're constrained by institutions and systems and the culture that has shaped us. And perhaps that's just a little bit more so for children. And so the law and the legal systems are part of that formative process that shape out what the kids can say and when and where and to whom. Dr. Spencer?
I like everything that everybody said.
Oh, you're so just open and...
So, when I read Joel Salatin's book, Folks This Ain't Normal,
Oh, yes.
the first chapter is about chores, which surprised me because I thought it was going to be a critique of agriculture. And I said, yay. I mean, this is what we need. Children are entitled. My kids did chores. They said, no, none of their friends did chores. On and on. Okay. So, there's a critique in there of our view of children. But I'm wondering, I'd like you to address this
That's a great question. Which, the fact that Dr. Dunn didn't know how I was using the word precious is an indicator of like, are you being sarcastic there, or are you real? So I think there's a fair critique in how I'm presenting this. Am I idealizing an Andean childhood and being overly realistic about a Western childhood, which you can't win, can you? You just can't. The research that I've done on historical childhood, I think is obviously tempering how I'm looking at this case. And so knowing about the very strategic and explicit work to create playgrounds and to have organized play and to have structured time and the diminishing free time of kids as they're at school longer and as their activities longer. And so there's a huge critique there. And Joel Salatin's work where he's like, my kid started a business and we sold meat. Rabbits, he went with rabbits. There were lots of them. I think that's true. And so good to think about that chapter as kind of maybe thinking about tone. And probably as I was presenting a little bit idealized about the Andean childhood, which gets at some of the questions that were brought up of like, yeah, they're presenting, their arguments are idealizing their own context. And so what do I do with that as a researcher? So that's a good thing for me to keep in mind. Keep thinking there. Dr. Dunn.
Piggybacking on that, I keep coming back to whether it's idealizing the Western or the Andean. I keep thinking that it's idealizing a certain social strata of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because even in the early 1900s, the people who are idealizing childhood or idealizing the angel in the home, that wasn't true for most people.
And the notions of childhood it's not all Westerners who get this. These notions are classed and they are raced. And so automatically a child of color as seen as being an adult before a white child is. So you can be a cute little 15-year-old white girl, but you can be a threatening 12-year-old black boy or black man. And into the 1930s, 40s, even now, you have children who have to work. They're cutting lawns. They're working under the table to get money to help buy clothes for school. It's not all Western childhood, but we have these notions. And I think the fact that these notions are normalized and used to judge and used to critique within our own culture and other cultures makes it legitimate to come in with a firmer voice to identify that. And it doesn't justify my sarcasm. But that's a factor that I'm thinking. Dr. Sparkman? So their extended 100-page PDF, I don't know of any, maybe there are 10-year-olds who have written autobiographies that are 100 pages, but they're not citing UN regulations and documents and coming at the ILO hardcore as an ethnocentric, paternalistic. And I haven't found a source to help me get a sense of that creation. of those documents. And so I know that NGOs, German and Swiss NGOs, and Save the Children Bolivia were supporting and helping to train these children. I don't know how active a role it is. Sometimes when you're reading the PDF or looking at some of the PDF, you're like, oh, there's a lot of errors in this. It needs some editing. I haven't come across more information about the process there, which is interesting. The images, so I didn't spend much time analyzing these images until, it's presentation time, and you're like, let's do some freeze frames or screenshots of these articles. And there's an analysis of the role of children in the news and how they're used. And so it used to be that women were what we acted for, of like, we need to save our women, so we go to war, or we need to save our women, so this justifies action among nations. But then after second wave feminism, women are independent actors out there on their own, so we don't go to war for them, so the only thing that's left is children. And so with the fall of communism, we work for children. And so you can think about the picture that became very popular of the Syrian child in the ambulance. So if any of you can call that to mind, and how that becomes the point. And it's an individual child. And all of the headlines that I captured, and I was going through, they're either landscape pictures of Bolivia in the Western outlets, or they're an individual child. Or maybe like just two that look like siblings. The Bolivian news outlets had multiple children. And so you have the child who is working at the brick factory versus you have groups of children. And so what does that lead us to think about, and how does that frame them as actors and relational agency? They're isolated, they're abstracted from their broader context and the relationships and families that they're a part of. Which I was like, oh. So I didn't quite look at all of them, but it's this like, this is fascinating. Okay.
I'm not sure if I missed this, but I was curious about, was it the legislation for child laborers, where and how the United States is specifically involved?
So the code for children and adolescents was far-reaching, and the child labor aspect was just one small part of it. And there were other social welfare and education pieces. The children, the UNATSPO was most engaged about the child labor. And then the US, and I need to follow this up. So each year, the State Department comes out with its TIP report on the trafficking in persons, and it also puts each nation on a watch list and a tier system of like, you're doing great on human trafficking and child labor, or like the green, yellow, red potentially, or they can be put on a watch list, and that has implications. If you're in the danger zone, that has implications for your exports. And so that's what the US began to work on, I believe, there. Dr. McCain? So the materials that I've looked at haven't given direct details on that. There's some videos, actually, the New York Times had a video where it's following one girl's course, and there are adults in the room, which, from my best impressions, have been hired by these nonprofits to kind of facilitate this work. But you see them electing their leaders and being taught about, like, this is how you start to make choices and go forward for action. It's not that's not the forefront of how they're advertising or talking about their work, though. It's kind of. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate so much your time.